what I want to do is just talk generally about how I've been looking at mobility management. And my work today is at Harvard, where I run programs for mayors and chiefs of staff and chief data officers for the largest U.S. cities. So I think about this in terms of what does the work of the mayor look like, and I put that into a framework that is I've been fighting, you might call mobility wars, I call them taxi wars, for about 30 years, from Indianapolis on through to New York City, and I'll weave a few of those in. But the concepts that maybe the building blocks as we move forward to a new mobility system seem to me to be the four that are up there on the slide right now. One, we move from a mode-centric to a user-centric and demand-driven system. We move from one that's kind of based on compliance, a regulatory approach based on compliance and caps, to ones that look at data driven by protocols. We look at a new role for government, one that's oriented about making the market work broadly for residents. And then lastly, kind of what's the new governance structure, because probably that box is the most problematic of all. So this is obvious, is why many of you are in your day-to-day work, but it's only recently been obvious, right, that transportation is supposed to be oriented around the customer and not around the mode. This is my first of many anecdotes. I first had this battle in Indianapolis as mayor over the following, which is, again, obvious, but the medallions were capped, as they are in many cities today. They were capped even in the old days in Indianapolis. And if you asked broadly why the medallions were limited, then the answer would be because, well, we wanted to make sure the taxis were safe, which obviously there's no relationship necessarily between the number of medallions and whether the taxis are safe. That's a different regulatory issue. And if you began to look at this matter, then in Indianapolis, and this is back in between 91 and 2000, the folks least served were those in the poorest neighborhoods who needed the services the most. And in fact, it turns out that those who wanted to be on the supply side often were moms and pops in those same neighborhoods who wanted to go into the taxi business and who couldn't get a medallion. So that was my first introduction into this kind of effort. And this is not a political talk, but this context will help. I'm a Republican, and my partner in that argument against the taxi cartels was the Urban League, right? Because many of the folks that they represented were the most harmed as a result of the system. So now we're moving into a system that says, how do we integrate all this information? How do we do it in terms of producing mobility? So what would that look like? What is government's role as it moves from kind of the political economy to the market economy? Of course, government's inherently political, but looking at it in terms of the consumer, what I call the user experience. And I've been thinking in my writing and on this particular subject that, I don't know what to do with my phone here, but so you use an app, right, because you like the experience, right, the UX of the experience. Well, if we think about the UX of mobility, I'm not thinking in terms of just the UX in the phone app. I'm thinking if we design a system around the user, that's broadly different than designing a system around the user of a bus or the user of a taxi or the user of a TNC or the user of a bike, right? We're thinking about a system designed around the user, kind of omni-channel experience of the user, and if we could come up with that orientation, it would dramatically change things. So we start with that, and we look at a market that tries to regulate through data, not caps on the supply side, that looks at how to establish a data sharing or a single truth platform, looks at the government's role as access and equity, and finally, kind of how do we allocate costs and how do we code the curb, if you will. So this is your mission here at Volpe and DOT generally, which is, what does transportation look like? What's mobility look like? So when I was deputy mayor of New York, the taxi and limousine service kind of reported to me. The TNCs were just coming in, so they kind of, however we regulated them or didn't, kind of reported to me. MTA ran the subways and most of the buses, and they clearly didn't report to me. And so there was nobody really in New York City, and we had a very enlightened mayor. I worked for Mike Bloomberg. There was nobody managing mobility. There was people managing modes of mobility, and there's a transportation system run by a very very competent commissioner, and she did a great job with respect to kind of managing the streets, but nobody's thinking about managing mobility and how do we move forward to that. And now we have the data tools to allow us to manage mobility. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. So let's think about this in the following way. So one way to begin with this is, there's been and Indianapolis has done this after I left, and a number of other cities have thought about kind of parking outsourcing. And traditionally, we've thought about the curb as a liability that needs to be maintained by a city. But today, the curb is valuable in many places in a city, right? So how do we think about the curb? And most cities really, truly don't know where their signage is located. They don't know in day-to-day dynamic way how it's being enforced, and they certainly haven't coded the curb in a way that allows them to evaluate the cost of using a particular part of the curb to drop off a bike or drop off a TNC or drop off an AV or the case may be. So as we think about managing mobility, we need to also inherently think about managing the curb, not managing parking, but managing the curb. And that will require, and LA is the most advanced, at least in thinking about this, which is code the curb, figure out where everything is located, and then figure out how we can use dynamic pricing as it relates to the use of the curb. And that would be whether an AV drops off at the curb. It would be whether the cities begin to pass ordinances that require TNCs to drop off in certain places. It would allow cities then to price where the scooters are dropped, and it would allow cities to use dynamic pricing to do that. So as we think about mobility, we have to think about managing the curb. Managing mobility, managing the curb go hand in hand. Now that also then has us thinking about what is government's role? Because, over the last 25 years, government's role has often been providing transportation like bus transit, or regulating transportation like in cabs as well. But inherently in this new mobility management system, where a government's core responsibility is going to be equity, right? How to make sure that the community is served broadly and fairly and openly. And some of the work I've been doing with these mayors and chiefs of staff at the Kennedy School has got them, and this is obvious to all of you as well, but has got them to look at, we did this in LA, so where are underemployed folks located, whether here, and here, where are the where are the employers that need jobs located, whether they're here, and here. Let's look at the transportation network, and it's kind of here, right? So as we think about access and equity, right, we think about how are we going to get folks who are underemployed to jobs in a more efficient manner. So government's role as it thinks about this is just Orlando's map of transit deserts, just like food deserts. Where are those transit deserts? Who lives in those transit deserts? What are the key areas where they need to go, and how do we solve that problem? That is the issue that cities should be attending to as contrasted to regulating a particular mode, right? So in order to do that, in order to kind of arrange the mobility, in order to cash the curb, if you will, right, to create revenues from managing the coding of the curb, cities need to have some, and I want to, at the end of this presentation, I want to kind of challenge my use of the word cities, because that's also a problem in a regional area, but let's just deal with cities for a second. They're going to need platforms, right? They're going to need a platform that serves as a way to assemble information among multiple providers so that there's real-time information about what's available. There's real-time information for management purposes. There's real-time information for purposes of pricing a particular drop-off space at a particular point in time. So the city's new role, in addition to equity, will be how do they create these platforms that have APIs that allow people to connect. Now, this is a little difficult to read, but in that regard, NACTO obviously is a leader here, and this is just one of their slides that suggests, well, what sort of information should a city insist on that be presented to it as a condition of using the street? So I was, see if it's in the next slide. I have another battle I want to tell you about, but I can see if it's here. These are a little out of here. So related to this, so in New York, when I was there probably 5 or 6 years ago, we were looking at the equity issues. And I started to look at this because there was a bus strike, and I went to the outer boroughs that didn't have subway access and realized how difficult it was for folks to get to work. And where the buses were on strike and the subways weren't accessible, and almost every other conveyance was illegal, right? If you said, how about a jitney, it's illegal. How about this, it's illegal, right? So because the system had been carefully controlled by capture, if you know, it was captured by the industry itself. Well, what we were able to do, which is 5 or 6 years ago, but also kind of what many of you are doing today, is to say, each of these, there's a GPS in every yellow cab meter, right? So you know every drop-off and every pickup in New York City in real time. So it turned out 97.5% of the pickups were kind of almost predictably, just south of Harlem down to downtown in Manhattan, and the other 2.5% were out here. And you go to the taxi medallion holders and say, we need more medallions, and they go, no, we have plenty of capacity. Well, from real-time management of the data that they didn't. And so I just introduced this slide a little bit out of order because, don't get dizzy here, because one of the things we need to consider in this new government role is what information should government require from a commercial operator in its jurisdiction as a condition to use its easements and streets. What's in real time, what's not in real time, what formats, how is privacy handled, how's anonymity handled, and we need to get there, and that sometimes will involve relatively easy to negotiate data sharing agreements like Louisville and others have with Waze, Boston does as well, which helps them with traffic, but other situations are more complex as well, because how much information do you take from a private operator, and then what do you do with that information along the way? So as we begin to do this, then we ask, okay, what other roles can government play? And this is a current test that South Bend, Indiana is doing. South Bend's a very progressive city in terms of the way it uses data. And it's competing for a Bloomberg grant, and they're doing a little A/B testing on the following, right? So their theory is that if they can get employers to chip in on vouchers, they can do shared rides to get employees to cut the distances for lower waged employees to get to work. And so they're trying to do a test, and they're doing a test, and their early results show that predictably that if they can cut the transit times, that there's less turnover on the part of the employer, right? So if you have to go a long distance in order to have a low-paid job, then as soon as you get an opportunity, you're going to stop doing that commute, right? So South Bend's been offering these vouchers and shared ride pooling as a way to cut the commute times for these workers in order to get more stability, more opportunity in the workforce. So as we think about planning, right, and think about equity, then this is one way to do it. And the city's responsibility with respect to arranging these rides, arranging the market, and subsidizing the rides is important as well. Similarly, as we think about mobility management, then the next issue that one faces is, how are we going to use behavioral economics and nudge theory? How are we going to use pricing to move around congestion? This was not using pricing, but it was an interesting example from San Francisco, where Lyft on its own essentially said, we're going to move from the most congested place in the city and rearrange our drop-off points. And I raised this today to suggest that I would hope and think that cities eventually are going to regulate their curb space by saying, here are the places where TNCs are allowed to drop off. Here are the places where they're not. Here's the price of dropping off at this particular point in time. And begin to price the drop-offs, because the curb and the streets cost the city money. They're being increasingly used by the TNCs. Most cities, right, have fought these battles about whether the TNCs should come into the marketplace at all or whether they ought to have caps. I'm suggesting an alternative way to think about it is, why don't we price these drop-off places? Why don't we price the curb, and why don't we regulate it in a way that moves around the drop-off places and makes them safer? And one can obviously see that what today is most cities think about as managing on-street parking will really become managing the curb, so that some of that street curb space is parking, Some is AV drop-offs, some is TNC drop-offs, and some is something we haven't even thought about. 2 years ago, who would have thought about Lime bike drop-offs, right? And now they're a pretty serious issue. That allows the government also to think about its role as a revenue redistributor, right? So because it's going to take in revenues from the use of its curbs and streets, and it's going to think about itself as a subsidizer of these rides, right? So how do we, a few cities have arranged shared Uber or Lyft rides to get folks to work. Should those be subsidized? How can they be subsidized? Where do those revenues come from? And we're in this kind of often zero-sum game where cities say, well, my transit agency doesn't have enough money anyway, so you're not going to take money from my transit agency in order to subsidize the TNCs. That feels like a cannibalization that's not very, doesn't have a lot of upside over time. But maybe there are other ways to come up with the money, like South Bend's from the employer, or like this situation where we think about what are the fees for Ubers or Lyfts or the like, and I'm not necessarily saying that a fixed fee is the right thing to do, like Manhattan's considering, but maybe it is a code the curb fee like other places are doing as well. Now, that keeps moving us into the direction of kind of the role of government, and the role of government is the aggregator of data that can be used for pricing and decisions on the part of consumers. And I use the, occasionally, and in different cities, the mobile parking app in the phone, right, that you all use in Cambridge. It's great, but why do cities license one company to have a mobile parking app? We ought to have multi-tenant parking, right? So we ought to have, some of these are going to be in your car, some are going to be in from different companies. So the city needs to think about itself as developing a platform with APIs that supports multi-tenant usage, regardless of where it's from. And then we're going to begin to seamlessly put these things together. And so the cities like Boston and Cambridge that did Park Cambridge, Park Boston, Park Chicago with mobile apps were very advanced. I thought I was pretty advanced in New York City when I fought the battle with the yellow cabs that brought the green cabs to the outer boroughs until I realized that I was actually fighting the last war and the next war with the TNCs, right? So I mean, so we need to have a dynamic system, and this is just an indicator of that. Similarly, that we have equity issues in the following sense. A lot of people have smartphones, but not as many people have data plans. This is just to suggest that how do we think about at least street-level access to free data. On the left is Link NYC that many of you know is those are the kiosks that took the place of the 10,000 phone booths in New York City. They're essentially 8-foot kiosks that are interactive, but more importantly, they have, for the purpose of this conversation, they support citywide free gigabit wireless access, right? And to the extent they're connected to the street furniture, they're connected to the street lights, then we begin to have an integrated data system that's available at the street level as well. Lastly, new interesting phenomena, but if you're going to think about managing mobility, I don't know where this is going to end up, but I'm just inherently suspicious of the regulatory role that begins with we only want so many of those, right? We only want so many scooters. We only want so many taxis. Right? Because those conversations, it just feels to me, and I've been in these battles for a long time, are inherently unfair to the poorest residents, right? Because we're basically saying we're going to limit the capacity. And so maybe a better way is to say is, how should we manage our streets in a way that keeps the clutter organized? And maybe that is that each one of these bikes, because it's obviously got a GPS in it, is regulated by where it's dropped off. Or it's regulated by its safety. Maybe it's not regulated by kind of capping it, but regulated in some way that allows us to avoid this situation, which is not good for use of the sidewalks either, right? Because the sidewalks cost money, and so the commercial user should be helping with, regardless whether it's dockless. Now, just in closing, so I think one of my biggest failures as mayor of Indianapolis was the issue, maybe the best way to say it, my greatest failure in Indianapolis as mayor was the subject about which I'm giving the speech and pretending to be an expert today. So I had this great idea in the mid-90s that we should go into mobility management, right? And Indianapolis had a transit system that was really mediocre, but we were a car-oriented city. What I thought I would do, I did two things, neither one of which worked. One was outsourced part of the operation of the transit system, and the other was to try to divide the planners out of the organization, right? Because I thought that if transit planning was in the organization that was also producing the transit, that the planners would only think about planning for the transit and not planning for the customer, right? Because they were part of that organization. So we split them apart. A number of not very good things happened. One was they still were transit planners, right? They still were kind of FTA transit planners, very professional, but they thought about where should the buses go. In Indianapolis, where those buses went, where they were all those the new accordion buses with the same few number of people in them, right? And so we tried to figure out where they would go. Then I thought, well, why don't you just then reduce the number of large buses and introduce some vans that we could then negotiate into the route structure. And then I got slapped by FTA because I was about to violate 13C labor laws and the amortization schedules for the buses and a number of other things that came with the funding of the system. And then meanwhile, the private operators of some of the routes were, I don't think they were even as professional as our operators, and they were just operating in the same kind of monopolistic situation. So I mention this because now we're 20 years later, some 20 years later, and we have enormous amounts of information. We have the ability to code the curve. We have the ability to have government have a much more enlightened approach to how it's managing mobility. You have a way to actually help folks who are underserved in many of our large communities, particularly if we're consumer UX oriented and not modal oriented. But the problem really isn't the federal government. The problem is local government because nobody's in charge, right? And the only regional organizations tend to be the transit organizations, and they still have planning mostly oriented towards the way they deliver those services. I still think that those things should be split apart. The MPOs are very important, but in many jurisdictions, if not most, they don't have the authority to force mayors to do something, right? And so as we think about going to the future, I would just suggest that we need to think about new governance structures. We need to think about regional governance structures. We need to think about more authority for the MPOs or the ability to split apart the transit agencies so that transit planning function. We need to think about what the platform looks like. Volpe and others are in a terrific place to suggest what the protocols and analytics should look like in those platforms. How do we think about analyzing them? What can we do? We need to think about FTA rules on labor and capital. And when we go through those things together, then we are in a place where we can make a substantial difference in the way we move people around. And in the end, the mobility is critical to the quality of life in these communities. We have tools now today we've never had before. We can predict in dynamic real-time changes. They're very difficult issues to negotiate with the Ubers and Lyfts and other proprietary owners of information, but they're not impossible. And the cities and regional authorities should use their licensing authority to require high quality and safety, but also the sharing of information. I think we can get to a much better place. Thank you very much for your time.